Welcome to another episode of the Country Music Unknown Legends podcast. I will be your host once again. My name is John Mathis Jr., and that fine steel guitar intro you just heard is Lloyd Green from the late 60s from the song titled Sugar Thief. Today's featured unknown legend really and truly is a legend. I think once you hear about his contributions and accomplishments in bluegrass and country music, you'll agree. In fact, I think today's unknown legend may be an example of what I've mentioned briefly before about fame. Perhaps if he were born a decade later and his accomplishments had happened later, his status in the memory of pop culture would be more prevalent. When all the research is in and I see an artist's list of credits, like in this case a million-selling record, then compare that with such a small amount of consumption of their music on streaming platforms, there is such a disparity between the past and present, which is one of the reasons for this podcast. So today, we're going to bring some well-deserved attention to Clyde Moody. It was in Cherokee, North Carolina on September the 19th in the year 1915 when Mr. Clyde Moody was born. Clyde Leonard Moody was the 11th child of 12 children. The family farmed, the work was hard, life was harder, and his father was said to be stern. Clyde came from a musical family. His father played clawhammer banjo, his older brother played banjo, and another one of his brothers played fiddle. Clyde had begun to play the guitar at the age of 9 years old. Around 1928, the Moody family moved to Marion, North Carolina. At 14 years of age, Clyde decided to leave with the hopes of becoming a musician, and his father told him not to bother to come back. His dad, who was half Cherokee Indian, ruled the family with an iron hand. He didn't tell you anything twice. So when Clyde got ready to leave home, his father said to him, "There's the road, and it has two ends, and you'll never make no money with that guitar." Clyde responded, "If I can't, I won't be back to bother you." To which his father finally replied, "That's fine, now get gone." Clyde found work in a logging camp for a while until he met J. Hugh Hall around 1933. They found a time spot at WSPA Radio in Spartanburg, South Carolina, and landed a 15-minute radio program. They called themselves the Happy-Go-Lucky Boys, a name they would continue to use after they became part of Wade Maynor's Sons of the Mountaineers in the fall of 1937. The Maynor Group recorded extensively for Bluebird Records, a division of RCA, shifting their radio base from spots at WIS Columbia, WPTF Raleigh, and WWNC in Asheville. In February 1940, they did a session as the Happy-Go-Lucky Boys without Wade Maynor, and soon after, Clyde parted company with the Maynors, but would find a new job. Moody soon joined forces with Bill Monroe as guitarist and lead singer in the chorus with the Bluegrass Boys. He played the first show on September the 6th, 1940, and then headed for Nashville to appear on the Grand Ole Opry the following night. While Bill and the Bluegrass Boys weren't quite playing what would become bluegrass, they were transitioning in that direction. A month later, Clyde did his first session as a bluegrass boy. He remained with the band except for short breaks until 1945. By the way, during the Monroe phase of Clyde Moody's career, his baseball skills came in handy as a pitcher on the Bluegrass Boys baseball squad. Monroe and his group recorded a tune written by Clyde called Six White Horses. Clyde, however, was absent from the 1941 Bluebird Records session as he had temporarily reformed the Happy-Go-Lucky Boys with Lester Flatt as a new member. Clyde eventually left Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys when he signed a contract with Columbia Records as a solo artist in February of 1945, which resulted in 4 songs being recorded, but only 2 were ever released. Meanwhile, he continued to work solo on the Opry. In 1946, Moody cut a pair of singles for the independent Bullet Records. One song, If I Had My Life to Live Over, became one of his best-known numbers. Clyde Moody's recording career took a big turn when he signed with the new King record label in 1947. His first release, the original version of Shenandoah Waltz, turned out to be a major hit and became his signature song. In 1951, the song came back to life on the pop charts. Tommy Tucker, an orchestra leader, did a recording of the song for the MGM label. Others recorded the song as well, including the Stanley Brothers, Jimmy Martin, Ernest Tubb, Lawrence Welk, and many, many others. Clyde remained with King Records through 1952, doing 50 solo recordings and 6 additional numbers as part of the sacred quartet Browns Ferry 4. Shenandoah Waltz came about when Clyde and a group of entertainers were on tour in Virginia. One day he happened to hear a fiddler in his band, Chubby Wise, play a tune that caught Clyde's attention. Clyde asked Chubby, "What was that?" Chubby said, "Oh, just something I dreamt up." So Clyde told him, "Let's put the music on paper and I'll write the lyrics for it." 12 minutes later, they had Shenandoah Waltz written. Many of Clyde's songs were in waltz time: Carolina Waltz, Waltz of the Wind, West Virginia Waltz, Cherokee Waltz, which earned him the name of the Hillbilly Waltz King, or simply the Waltz King. In the middle of the 1940s, when country music was beginning to evolve and thrive, he turned some heads in the country music industry and even lost favor with some. He added a trumpet and a piano to his act. In that era, those instruments were not considered to be part of the genuine country music sound. But Clyde explained in an interview, "I wanted a country song with a Glenn Miller sound. Some people said I'd lost my mind." He remained with the Opry through 1948, when he went to WARL in Arlington, Virginia, to work for Connie B. Gray in his shows in the Washington, D.C. area for 18 months. One of the concerts at Constitution Hall on April the 24th, 1948, drew a crowd of over 5,000 people. In a later interview, he recalls when he made the decision to do a televised 30-minute show for Connie B. Gray from Constitution Hall. He noted there was no CBS, NBC, or ABC networks as there are today. Television was still in its infant stages of growth. Clyde said, "The TV screens were only 6 inches wide. I weighed 215 pounds and took the whole screen up." After leaving Connie B. Gay, he worked for a time on WDBJ Roanoke and at WDVA as headliner of the Virginia Barn Dance. When he went to WVA in Danville, Virginia, the station began the WDVA Virginia Barn Dance. Those type of shows were popular in Virginia. Richmond had a couple of versions of its own Old Dominion Barn Dance, with Sunshine Sue's leadership lasting over a decade. It spawned the competing Atlantic Barn Dance. The show rapidly gained popularity and notice. It became part of the Saturday night rotation over the Mutual Broadcasting System of barn dance shows in February 1953. The network would broadcast a half hour at 8:30 p.m. on Saturday nights. The Richmond show was the first to get in the rotation. During the early 50s in 1951, Clyde also made his way down to Shreveport, Louisiana, to the Louisiana Hayride, where he performed on the same shows with Webb Pierce, Slim Whitman, the Wilburn Brothers, Kitty Wells, and others, including one of our previous Unknown Legends podcast features, Okie Jones. Hillbilly music was in the news in the early 50s. There was even a campaign to declare the birthday of Jimmie Rodgers National Hillbilly Music Day in 1953. Clyde had the honor of meeting Jimmie Rodgers earlier in his career and commented on this in an oral interview preserved by the Country Music Hall of Fame in 1974. Clyde also sang with a young Elvis Presley in 1955 when Colonel Tom Parker paired them for a 6-week tour. Moody recalled Elvis years later as a nice kid. Clyde Moody extended his musical career for the better part of the next 4 decades, although his days as a major figure were pretty much over. He signed with Decca, that released only 3 singles in about as many years, and from 1972 on, Clyde made 3 solo albums for Old Homestead Records, 1 bluegrass, 1 country, and 1 of sacred music. In the 1980s, at the age of 69, Clyde embarked on another chapter of his recording career. His friend since the 1940s, Aubrey Mayhew, signed him to his Black Rose Records label. His first release on the label was a tune Mayhew wrote called California Dreams. The song was on the Cashbox Top 100 Country Singles chart for 8 weeks, peaking at number 64 on March the 31st, 1984. Clyde wrote the flip side, While My Heart Is Breaking. In an interview with Joe Edwards in June of 1984, Clyde commented on his era of concerts and said it was one of the occasional lonely pockets. Clyde said, lots of times I didn't collect anything on a bad day or something. I'd say to the promoter, catch you on the next round. His appearances in the early days were not the 15,000-seat arenas of the modern era. He said people would come to his shows with their mules and they'd just use lanterns for lights. Lots of times you'd play in school auditoriums, you'd get 200 if you were lucky, and sometimes the crowd would spill out into the schoolyard. In that Joe Edwards interview, Clyde commented on his love for the waltz. Three-quarter music has always been a favorite of mine. Any place on earth, when you come to three-quarter music, the dance floor fills up. Clyde played and sang with everybody who was anybody during his career. He performed in a white hat and reportedly wore out 21 Cadillacs during his travels to appearances throughout the South. He was quoted as saying, I've never gone any place where I couldn't go back. I've never mistreated anyone. Clyde Moody died on April the 7th, 1989 in Nashville, Tennessee. Moody performed at the White House several times over his career and was inducted into the North Carolina Music Hall of Fame in 2011. Clyde Leonard Moody had significant achievements in three forms of country music. First, as an old-time musician in Wade Maynard's Sons of the Mountaineers, including the Happy-Go-Lucky Boys. And second, as an emerging bluegrass musician in work with Bill Monroe in the early 1940s. Clyde was also an early pioneer in the post-World War II more modern forms of country music, popularized by such better-known vocalists as Eddie Arnold. His music was influential on a lot of young artists in the late 40s who were wanting to sing country music, including my father, Country Johnny Mathis. They became friends in the 80s. My dad would take us out to visit Clyde and his wife Frances at their home in Ashland City, Tennessee. So I had the privilege to meet Mr. Moody while I was a young teenager. My dad was incredibly honored to pay tribute to Clyde and sing at his funeral in 1989. Clyde Moody, our featured unknown legend in this episode of the Country Music Unknown Legends podcast. Clyde Moody is a legend.